And next we turn to Selectman Karen Johnson to cover the area of governance and transition. Welcome, Karen.
Good morning. Thank you.
What do we mean by governance, and how did the town approach this work of governance?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've heard a lot about numbers, and so not being a mathematician, they gave me the governance task. I approached governance with the same diligence that the finance people did. We put together a group that made up of Charlie Cristello, who's a former town administrator here in Hingham, and Josh Krumholtz, who's a partner at a law firm in Boston, to consider the options for structuring the water company should town meeting vote to purchase it. So state law provides towns, municipalities with a number of options for constructing a governance paradigm. And we did a few things. We looked around, as Hingham often does, at how other communities run their water system. And there are 351 communities in Massachusetts. As we've heard quoted, most all of those communities run their water as a department of their public works department. And how they govern their water is actually through the executive branch of government, their board of selectmen or their mayor. But we took a finer point. We narrowed those 351 communities down to 41 communities, which is the cohort of medium-sized water systems in the Commonwealth. And we did that because Hingham is also classified as a medium-sized water company. So then we said, okay, well, how do people like us govern their water systems? And we found actually the same to be true, that water is governed typically through the executive branch of government. So in 38 cases, boards of selectmen or mayors are the water commissioners, typically following a model like we've followed, hiring an expert who actually runs the system, and in some cases partnering with a for-profit entity, which is our model, to actually operate the water company, and in some cases using town employees to operate the water company. So what we mean by governance is, at the end of the day, the buck's got to stop somewhere. And state law provides that the town meeting can appoint its board of selectmen as the water commissioners, and that's where the buck would stop.
What does day one structure look like, assuming that the town approves this acquisition?
Sure. So as I suggested in the opening, there's a number of ways you could structure your water company. You could partner it with Hingham Light Plant, a very successful operation. We could partner it with our friends at the sewer department. We could run that together. And those may be things that we consider in the future. But what the governance group narrowed in on was how do we operate the water system on day one, and how do we operate it with a structure that would be successful? And so in that case, what we have suggested to town meeting is that the board of selectmen serve as the water commissioners. We hire a licensed water superintendent. And what I mean by that is the Department of Environmental Protection requires certain licensures for folks who deal with our water. Thank goodness, right? So we would hire a water superintendent who's licensed by the DEP to run water. We would put out an RFP to hire an operating company to run the water system. And that operating company would then partner with any number of capital vendors who are expert in a particular capital project that the water company needs to undertake. So the day one structure flows down from the Board of Selectmen. It would flow through the town administrator, who would be the direct supervisor of the water superintendent. The water superintendent is a town employee, which we felt was very important to the supervision of then the vendor that we hired to run the water company. We need somebody who can talk the talk of the technicalities of running a water system, and we need somebody on our team to fulfill that role. There's two sort of sidebars to that kind of linear organizational structure. One is we realized that we needed more bandwidth on transition from Aquarion to the town of Hingham, and we needed expertise as part of that process. So our approach to that is really twofold. One is to bring in expert volunteers. Hingham is really good at leveraging, I think, the knowledge in this town. And if folks have been listening to any of the open forums or public meetings, you realize that we have everybody from civil engineers to hydrologists who are very concerned and interested in this project. Our goal would be to bring some of those folks together with financial people on a transition and evaluation team. That group would be appointed in concert with a moderator and would work to transition, again, the operation from Aquarion to the town of Hingham. On the other side of the organizational chart, we've institutionalized a public voice for citizens to have an ongoing say in the operation of their water company. So the Citizens Advisory Board at this juncture would be made up of representatives from Hull, Cohasset, and Hingham, and would work with the water superintendent on both rate setting and customer issues. And the reporting lines that we've structured in the organizational chart include, direct relationship with the water superintendent by both of those committees, as well as direct lines of report to the Board of Selectmen as water commissioners. And, let me just say one thing, because people have said, what do you know about being a water commissioner? And I think it's a fair question. I will say that boards of selectmen, including the Hingham Board of Selectmen, serve in a policymaking role for any number of technical areas in town. So just the other night at our meeting, this past Tuesday night, two issues came up that I thought, wow, we do exercise this policy oversight over the technical people that have the expertise to get the job done. So our fire chief came in, and he wanted to move some money around so that he could buy automated CPR equipment. So we were able to explore with him why he needed that, what that equipment does, why that's vital to the ambulance service that Hingham runs. So I'm not a firefighter, I'm not an EMT, but I'm able to ask questions of those folks that are responsible for that very vital service to this town and make sure that we're doing the right thing in terms of resources and support for that operation. The other thing that we did on Tuesday night was a road opening by National Grid. So when a utility comes into Hingham and wants to work on our roads and fix the underlying pipes that lie in the road, just like Aquarion does, they have to come to us and ask permission. And there's a series of technical questions that, natural gas is not something you want to fool around with. And so again, the Board of Selectmen exercises that policy oversight for very important functions in this town every day of the week, and water would be no different. Additionally, as I said at the outset, most every municipality runs their water this way. And so there are educational programs for policymakers run in particular by New England Water Works that the Board of Selectmen would intend to be to undertake prior to embracing the role as water commissioner.
Karen, over 35% of the water ratepayers are outside of the town of Hingham, and we're talking about Hull and North Cohasset. And so how common is it for a municipally owned system to service its customers in other communities?
Sure. It's a great question, and I think it's one that we get every time we stand up to speak. And I will say a couple things about that. The governance group, at the outset, as I suggested, the governance group approached their task much like the finance group did, and that was, should we continue to evaluate this, or should we turn back? And so one of the obvious questions was, well, if the town of Hingham is the one that has the embedded right to purchase under the special act that formed the water company, does it make sense today that Hingham exercise that right and then end up operating water outside its geographic boundaries? Mm-hmm. So we evaluated the activities of the towns within that 41 town cohort that we talked about, the other medium-sized water companies in the Commonwealth. And we said, okay, well, what do they do? Do they provide water to other folks? And the answer to that was a resounding yes. And so water gets provided in a couple different ways to other municipalities. So municipalities can either sell bulk water to another municipality where they bring water to the town line and they turn it over to the distribution system of that other town. Because water resides in certain pockets, so some towns might not have direct access to a watershed, which they need. And then sometimes there are customers in those other towns where the providing town actually owns the pipes, has the customers in the other municipality, they send bills, they provide water, people turn on their shower, turn on their faucet, and the water flows. The other thing that we did was we evaluated our system with the DEP, with folks in the Southeast Regional Office of the DEP. And we said to them, how common is it for municipalities to provide water outside their geographic boundaries. And I was all excited about this question because I thought for sure he was going to say, stop right there. And instead, he just shrugged his shoulders. And he's like, that's the way water works. And if you think about it intuitively, water doesn't know whether it's in Hingham or Hull or North Cohasset. Water's just traveling the path that it travels. Yes. And that's consistent across the Commonwealth, where the geographic boundary of the municipality doesn't stop the provision of water to other folks. We have folks in Hingham as part of the Aquarion system that actually get their water from Rockland because the pipes in Rockland are closer for the folks at that end of Hingham. And Rockland sends them a water bill. So it's not unheard of. The scale of this is larger than other municipalities. But, and again, I think that was a stopping point for us as well. Does that create a hurdle? And the analysis that we undertook was, once you've crossed that boundary, the numbers become somewhat of a distinction without a difference. Mm-hmm. And so we are purchasing a system with existing pipes. It's not like we purchased the Hingham municipal system and we're looking to expand into Hull. We're purchasing a system that includes Hull and North Cohasset. And I think we feel confident we can run it, and we received that confirmation from the Department of Environmental Protection.
Karen, any time that there's a change in the service provider, in this particular case, we're talking about an acquisition of a privately owned water system into a municipally owned water system. And as a ratepayer, there's concern as to will they have a voice? How can you assure ratepayers in the towns of Hull and North Cohasset and Cohasset that they will have a voice under this new municipally owned system by Hingham?
So that's another question that's come up on several occasions. And one in particular came up at the Saturday open forum that the town ran. And my first answer to the question is, all of us, Hingham, Hull, and North Cohasset, have zero voice now. Nobody asked us when Kelda sold to Macquarie. Nobody asked us when Macquarie sold to Eversource. We have zero line of sight into capital allocation or allocation of capital dollars and who operates our system. And frankly, we would have no voice if Eversource decided to sell to somebody else. So that's our starting point, right? Is zero effect on a vital resource to all of us. So the municipal model, I think, provides public access and public voice in a couple different ways. One is that all of the decisions, the leadership, and all of the decisions affecting the system are local. So, we were in Hull last night for a Board of Selectmen meeting, and one of the things we said was, every Tuesday night, the Board of Selectmen sit and hold their meetings. And if you have an issue with your water, you drive over the town line, you come to our meeting and you ask to be recognized and you express your concern. So there's a person, there are people that neighbors of yours, that will be running and in charge of this resource. In addition to that, we've institutionalized a public voice as part of the structure of governing the system, and that's the Citizens Advisory Board that we talked about earlier, where residents from Hingham, Hull, and North Cohasset will gather together with the water superintendent to take comments and questions and concerns from customers and to work on the rate-setting process with the water superintendent.
Karen, what type of financial model mechanism will be used to support this acquisition?
Sure. So, it's important, I think, in this situation, especially given the involvement of Hull and North Cohasset as well as Hingham, that we find a way to segregate the assets and the liabilities and the revenues of the water system from those of the town of Hingham. And the mechanism that state law gives us to do that is the establishment of an enterprise fund, which actually has to be approved by town meeting. So it's a way for town meeting to say, we're going to take this tranche of our economic activity and we're going to put it in a separate account. And that separate account tracks both, as I said, revenues and liabilities in that separate accounting structure. So the important thing, I think, for all ratepayers to know is what that means is at the end of a fiscal year, if there's any surplus revenue, that would drop to the bottom line of the enterprise fund, not to the bottom line of the town. So it wouldn't be commingled with the general fund of the town. So it allows the enterprise fund to capture retained earnings, which we envision would happen in year one. So town meeting this year will be asked to establish an enterprise fund with an enterprise fund budget that shows a $4.8 million drop to the bottom line of retained earnings. And what we'd like to suggest that we do with the retained earnings surplus would be something like a capital reserve or a rate stabilization fund. It also gives us some cushion for unanticipated expenses during year one. But to think about in year one, with Aquarion rates, the town would be able to drop to the bottom line almost $5 million is pretty incredible. So I think all ratepayers can be confident that, number one, we've provided for significant resources and a significant cushion within the enterprise fund budget, and we'll separately account for the assets and liabilities of the water company within that accounting mechanism.
Indeed, that is a concern, I think, of ratepayers as to will we see a spike in rates again, from a historical perspective under the for-profit model. So what does rate setting look like in a public model versus a for-profit model?
Yeah, so the Aquarion works with the Department of Public Utilities in its rate setting process. And for-profit entities can essentially pick when they want to raise rates. So if their costs are escalating, they can decide that they're going to go into the DPU. They pick a test year, which is the year that DPU would look at to determine the expenses that are rightly allocable to the rate payers, and they would request a rate increase, which we just saw last year. It's a highly, I guess I call it highly stylized conversation because it takes place in Boston. The DPU attorneys are there, our attorneys are there, there was an attorney from Hall there, the Attorney General's office there is there. The people who aren't there are us, the ratepayers. So DPU is meant to be a proxy for our public voice, I guess, as is the Attorney General's office. But I'd suggest that DPU is an imperfect proxy for the public voice because part of what the DPU allows, essentially, is a return on equity, which is a profit element that then flows through from Aquarion up to its shareholder, Eversource, and then through Eversource to its shareholders, which in its 2018 proxy statement suggested that the dividends payable to those top-tier shareholders were well in excess of what other people in the public utility space were experiencing. So I guess I'd suggest to you that while the DPU process, some people have tried to take comfort in, I guess I don't take a great deal of comfort that they're actually drilling down on what rate increases mean to ratepayers. And again, it's a process that I find distant and inaccessible to the average citizen who might have a concern about water rates. In contrast, the rate setting process and budgeting process for the water company in Hingham under municipal ownership would follow the same budgeting process that police, sewer, fire, the country club, all of our elements of town operations go through a very diligent, methodical process that includes evaluation by the Board of Selectmen and your advisory committee. Every single dollar is evaluated. And so in this case, the Citizens Advisory Board would work with the water superintendent to develop a budget in concert also with the town administrator. So what do we need to operate this system? What are our costs? And absent from that equation, importantly, is a profit element. That's not what the town of Hingham does. That's not what a municipal operator of a water system does. We need to know exactly how much it costs us, and that includes capital infrastructure development, but not a dollar more than that. So the beginning part of the process, as I suggested, would involve the Citizens Advisory Board. We talked about that earlier. That board includes representatives from Hingham, Hall, and North Cohasset. They would then make a recommendation that would go to the Board of Selectmen and the Advisory Committee, and ultimately to town meeting. At the end of all that process, the water commissioners, in this case and at this time, are the Board of Selectmen. They would hold a vote to vote rates. The important thing about all of this is the Citizens Advisory Board, the Advisory Committee, the Board of Selectmen are all public bodies under the state's open meeting law. So every piece of business we transact, every piece of paper that we touch is a public record and accessible by the public. So if people have concerns about their rates, that will all be considered at town hall, not in Boston.
Talking about transition as we make our way in this direction, we talked earlier about day one, what that looks like. Are there any other elements within the transition? Who's involved in that transition? Who's helping the town with this transition? Are there other elements that you want to illuminate on?
Sure, yeah. The transition phase I would be excited about because I think it's the first step in the municipality sort of taking back control of its water resource. And we understand that this is a technically regulated, highly regulated area. And it's an important resource, important service to the citizens of the three communities served by the water system. So we've actually engaged a consultant, Robert Golich, who was a former commissioner of the DEP and former Secretary of Environmental Affairs for the Commonwealth, to help us work with the DEP in transitioning the system through the regulatory process. So I think that's another important thing for folks to understand. You know, I don't know about you all, but I raised kids and they got their driver's license, and you know, they'd turned 16 and they thought they could take the keys and off they'd go in the car. That's not the way this transition works. When we purchase the water company, we have to demonstrate to the Department of Environmental Protection that we can do the job. And so we will work with our consultant, Mr. Golich, and we will work with the DEP to ensure that when we take over the water registration rights and run the system, we have the capacity to do that. And by capacity, the DEP defines that to include financial capacity, technical capacity, and managerial capacity. So you have to have the leadership of the system, you have to have the money to do it, and you have to know exactly what you're doing in order to run a water system. So DEP will not sign off on the transfer of the registration right until the town demonstrates that it has the capacity in all three of those areas to run water.
Staying on that topic for just a moment, what assurances will we have that Aquarion will be a good steward in helping with that transition? Any
Sure.
sense for that?
Yep. Well, Aquarion has, I think there are 2 points I'd make there. Aquarion has an obligation under Massachusetts law of good husbandry, which is essentially running the water company as a going concern until the town goes through this regulatory process and is ready to take the wheel. And so they are, you know, I'm a trust lawyer by training, so I think in terms of, you know, fiduciary capacity, and this may not be a full fiduciary capacity, but they're operating the system as a placeholder for the town until the town's ready to operate it. And that has implications under Massachusetts law. The other thing is, you may know from prior conversations with my colleagues that because it's a for-profit entity, Aquarion is regulated by the DPU, the Department of Public Utilities. And as a little bit of an aside here, you know, folks have asked about the role of the DPU. The DPU is in the picture because Aquarion is a for-profit company. And so without the voice of the DPU, as limited as it is in the process, Aquarion could run water. You know, it's a utility monopoly, but it could run water without any accountability to the public. So the DPU is sort of the proxy for the public voice in the running of water by a for-profit entity. So the other point where there would be some regulation of Aquarion's behavior during the transition period would be oversight by the DPU, in particular of capital dollars spent. And the DPU has required in its most recent findings that if the town were to purchase the water company on April 22nd, that Aquarion would be obligated to report to the DPU that action and to sit with the DPU to, I think, review the deployment of capital dollars at that point.
Got it. Are there any other final key points that you want to make, a message that you want to deliver to our voters?
Yeah, I'd say we can do this, folks. You know, we've looked at other towns around us that do this every day of the week. We have undertaken careful study of this issue, we would not be frivolous with taking over an operation as important to all of us as water. That's number one. So we can do this. Number two, I think we have to do this. And I'd say that for two reasons. One is water is a finite resource. Our watershed is fragile and is defined by DEP to be highly stressed. And the only way we're going to rescue that is to deploy capital in an accelerated manner. And so you could deploy capital in an accelerated manner and you could pay through the roof for it, or you could deploy capital through municipal ownership within the rate structure that we have. The Board of Selectmen in Hingham, and I'm sure Hull and North Cohasset, work every day to use your tax dollars as carefully as we possibly can. But you well know that that's not the all-in cost of living in town. And water is part of that all-in cost. So the rate structure and rate sensitivity is an important issue, I think, to ratepayers, but also to the governance structures in our towns. So I think the health of our system depends on accelerated capital dollar investment, and I think we have a plan to do that in a way that doesn't break the bank. So I would ask for your attendance at town meeting on April 22nd, and I would respectfully ask for your vote to support the acquisition of the water company. Thank you.
Selectman Karen Johnson, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful
It's a nice morning.
thoughts.
Thank you.
All right.